Have you ever wondered who cleaned out the toilets before plumbing? Who scraped fat off rotting whales? Or who made a living by stealing corpses from graves? History isn't just kings and castles. It's also blood, filth, and some of the most revolting jobs imaginable. From medieval cesspits to Victorian sewers, this journey might make your skin crawl. So take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support keeps the history flowing. And now, let's begin. In medieval England, before sewage systems, before indoor plumbing, before any organized waste removal, there were gong farmers, men paid to descend into cesspits, foul-smelling holes beneath public latrines, or under private homes of the wealthy. Their job was simple in concept, and horrific in execution. They removed human waste by hand, night soil, urine, rotted straw, animal matter, everything that had collected over months, or sometimes years. Using wooden shovels and heavy leather buckets, they scooped sludge into carts, then hauled it out of town, often to nearby fields, where it was sold as fertilizer. The work was done at night, by law, to avoid offending the public during the day, and to reduce the smell in crowded areas, hence the name, nightmen, or more commonly, gong farmers, gong being an old word for dung. Their tools were crude, buckets, ropes, picks, and shovels. They wore thick garments, often soaked through with waste, and tied rags over their faces. Though it did little to block the stench, cesspits could be several feet deep, sometimes sealed off for years, filled with compacted waste, rotting food, dead rats, and once opened, released clouds of noxious gas, methane, ammonia, and other toxic fumes. It was dangerous. Gong farmers occasionally passed out from the fumes. Some even died of asphyxiation inside the pits. Others drowned, sucked under by unstable sludge, with no one able, or willing, to pull them out. The pay was better than most labor. In some towns, gong farmers earned up to 6 pence a night, far more than a typical farmhand, but they were social outcasts, feared for their smell, avoided in public spaces, refused service at many inns and shops. Even their children were shunned. Marriage prospects were few, and despite their essential work, they were treated with contempt. In larger cities like London or York, the need was constant. Thousands of residents used communal latrines, and the pits filled quickly. Some wealthy homes had private cesspits, but these too needed cleaning, and only gong farmers could legally do it. Their work was regulated by local law. In London, a gong farmer had to be licensed and follow specific hours and disposal rules. They were not allowed to dump waste near rivers, nor near wells or public roads, but enforcement was weak, and shortcuts were common. Sometimes waste was dumped illegally into rivers, like the Thames, contributing to centuries of pollution and outbreaks of disease, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, all linked to human waste and drinking water. Yet few alternatives existed. Without gong farmers, the cities would have drowned in their own filth. They provided an invisible backbone to urban life, quietly, night after night, hauling away what no one wanted to think about. By the 17th century, the term gong farmer began to fade, replaced by other titles, nightman, scavenger, or simply, sewer worker. But the job stayed largely the same, even as cities grew, and cesspits gave way to chamber pots and early sewer pipes. Manual labor remained essential. In the 19th century, with industrialization, flush toilets and underground sewers began to spread, especially in places like London, Paris, and New York. But even then, clogged pipes, overflowing drains, and backup systems still required human workers to enter and clean. The legacy of gong farmers lived on in every underground maintenance worker, in every sanitation laborer crawling through the dark, scraping and hauling, doing what most people would never dream of doing. And Though modern sanitation has advanced, the basic principles remain. Waste goes out. Someone must deal with it. It's a constant cycle. Often hidden, often ignored, but absolutely vital to city life, to public health, and to the daily comfort of millions. The history of gong farmers is the history of civilization's dirty foundation, where progress always leaves waste behind, and someone always has to clean it up. In 19th century London, beneath the surface of the city, past the cobblestone streets and gas lamps, lurked a dark, wet labyrinth. Miles of sewer tunnels, crisscrossing under homes, shops, and alleys. And inside these tunnels worked the toshers and the mudlarks, scavengers of the underworld, men and boys, sometimes entire families, who descended into the sewers, searching for anything of value. They were not employed by the city. They worked for themselves, picking through filth and runoff, for coins, for bits of copper, brass, bones, tools, clothing, or anything that could be cleaned and sold. The toshers worked deep in the tunnels, armed with long poles and lanterns tied to their chests. Their boots sunk into black sludge. Their fingers scraped brick walls for loose change, sometimes finding dropped jewelry, sometimes only rats, and always the overwhelming stench. Sewers were dangerous places. Rising tides from the Thames could flood tunnels. Without warning, gas pockets could ignite, and many toshers worked by candlelight. One wrong move could mean death by drowning, or suffocation, or falling into an open drain shaft. Toshers carried licenses, though many worked illegally, and faced arrest if caught. But with little work for the poor, it was worth the risk. In a good week, a skilled tosher could earn a few shillings, enough to feed a family. The mudlarks, often younger, worked along the river banks, especially the exposed mud at low tide. They waded through gray sludge, barefoot, or in worn shoes wrapped in rags, using sticks or bare hands. They dug through the muck, searching for metal scraps, rope, nails, cloth, dead animals, even coal that had fallen from passing boats. Mudlarks were usually children, many under the age of 10, boys and girls alike, some orphans, some sent by desperate parents, their faces smeared with dirt, their fingers raw and blistered. A full day's haul might fetch a few pennies, sold to junk dealers, or pawned for bread. They were always filthy, often hungry, and frequently ill. Cuts on their feet and hands became infected. Exposure to cold, wet conditions caused disease. Many suffered from respiratory problems, from years of breathing damp, dirty air. Mudlarking was not regulated. It was unofficial, a survival tactic more than a trade, but it was common, especially along the Thames. By the 1850s, the work of toshers and mudlarks became more dangerous. London's population was growing fast, and waste from thousands of homes poured directly into the river. Human waste, animal waste, chemical runoff from factories, all flowed into the sewers, and from there, into the Thames. The smell became unbearable. Known as the Great Stink of 1858, it led to a public health crisis. Parliament was forced to act, and engineer Joseph Bazalgette began building a new sewer system, larger, deeper, and better designed. It reduced surface runoff and helped contain disease, but it also made the work of toshers harder. Fewer valuables washed into the new system, and enforcement increased. By the end of the 19th century, toshing was mostly illegal, and mudlarking declined, replaced by organized sanitation and modern waste disposal. But the legacy of these workers remains. Some items recovered from that time now sit in museums: bent forks, clogs, medallions, all found in the mud, by hands stained with sewage, by lives shaped by poverty. Their job, unseen by polite society, but essential to survival. They cleaned nothing, but they salvaged everything, and in doing so, showed just how far people will go to survive. to earn, to endure, in the filth beneath a growing city, where history often flows downstream and settles in the mud. In parts of rural England and Wales, from the 17th century into the 19th, there existed a strange and unsettling practice, the hiring of sin-eaters. Men, sometimes women, who were paid to eat food placed on the bodies of the dead, a crust of bread, a bowl of ale, or a simple meal, set directly upon the chest, or passed over the corpse. Believed to absorb the sins of the departed, the act was ritualistic, a substitute for confession. For those who died suddenly, or without a priest, the sin-eater stood in, a living vessel, taking in the spiritual burden, so the soul of the dead could pass clean into the afterlife. The role was unofficial, not recognized by the church. In fact, it was condemned, viewed as heretical. But among the poor and isolated, it was quietly practiced, especially in mountainous or remote regions, where clergy were scarce and local customs endured. The sin-eater would be summoned by the family, sometimes just hours after death. He would arrive in silence, dressed in plain tattered clothing, rarely greeted, rarely thanked. He would sit near the corpse, often on a stool at the head of the coffin, and the food would be brought. Bread laid on the chest, ale placed near the mouth. In some cases, the food was passed over the body in a ritual motion, or even touched to the lips of the dead, then handed to the sin-eater, who consumed it in full view, as family members watched, often in silence, sometimes whispering prayers, sometimes weeping. The sin-eater would say a few words, not a formal blessing, but a spoken acknowledgement. Give easement and rest now to thee, dear man, or woman. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows, and for thy peace, I pawn my own soul. Amen. Then he would leave, paid in coins, sometimes bread and beer, and almost always, scorned by those he helped, seen as unclean, as one who carried the weight of many sins. Cursed in life, though useful in death, they were feared. Superstitions grew around them. People avoided eye contact. Some crossed themselves when a sin-eater passed by. Few would sit near them in church, if they attended at all. Some worked for decades, eating at dozens or hundreds of funerals, each time adding to the burden, never allowed to speak of the dead, or of the sins they believed they had taken. The tradition was passed orally, never written, often denied, and yet, it persisted, even into the early 1800s. In isolated parishes, where priests still arrived too late, and where people still feared the soul's unrest, it was a job no one wanted, and one no one could admit they needed. Sin-eaters were both servant and scapegoat, and their work existed in a moral gray zone, between folk religion and Christianity, between fear of hell and the hope for mercy. No formal records were kept, but local accounts and oral histories preserve the memory. A few names survive. Richard Munslow, often called the last sin-eater, died in 1906 in Shropshire. He had performed the ritual in his village, long after the practice had faded elsewhere. But even he was buried with little mention. The legacy of sin-eaters is uneasy, a reminder of spiritual anxiety, of how people coped with death. When answers were few, and rituals were many, they were not priests, not healers, not criminals. They were just people, who stepped into the space between death and belief, who took on what others could not bear, and in doing so, carried the invisible weight of the sins of strangers, mile after mile, funeral after funeral, in silence, and in shame, so that others might find peace in death. In the 14th century, across Europe, the Black Death swept through cities and villages, killing tens of millions, a third, sometimes half, of entire populations, dead in days. From fever, from swollen lymph nodes, from internal bleeding. It struck quickly, without warning. In this environment, a new figure emerged, recognizable even centuries later, the plague doctor. covered head to toe, in long black robes, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, most famously, wearing a beaked mask, stuffed with herbs and spices. The beak was filled with dried flowers, rosemary, lavender, cloves, thought to purify the air and protect the wearer from disease. Plague doctors were hired by towns, not by families. They were often outsiders, traveling from city to city. Wherever outbreaks occurred, their job was not to cure, but to record, to count the dead, to witness symptoms, and to attend the sick. With limited tools, limited knowledge, and almost no protection from infection, they carried wooden canes to examine patients at a distance, to lift blankets, or to prod swellings without touching skin. They might also use leeches or lances to drain buboes. Though none of these methods worked, the disease spread through fleas, carried by rats, and later through respiratory droplets, which the beaked mask could not stop. Some plague doctors were trained, many were not. They included physicians, barbers, apothecaries, and sometimes criminals, offered freedom in exchange for service. Few survived long, many died within weeks of arrival. Despite their suits, despite their masks, despite the rituals and prayers, they walked into homes of the dying, into streets filled with corpses, into infected hospitals and plague houses, often alone, sometimes forbidden to leave town. Until the outbreak ended, they recorded death, tolls, testified to wills, signed off on burials. They lived apart from others, kept in isolation, given food through doors or windows. Some were attacked, feared by townspeople, blamed for spreading the disease, or simply for being near it. Many were buried, quickly, in mass graves, without names, just like the patients they treated. Their suits became iconic, but those beaked masks did not appear until the 1600s. In earlier outbreaks, plague doctors wore simple robes and wrapped cloth around their faces. The bird-like costume was first described in France and Italy, designed by Charles Delorme, a physician to the French court. It was meant to shield the body, to create a barrier between the living and the dead, but it did little to stop the spread. The mask gave a false sense of safety, and most doctors still became infected. The plague came in waves. In 1347, in 1361, in 1374, and then again and again, across Europe, for centuries. Each time, the death toll rose, and plague doctors returned, sometimes hired in desperation, sometimes conscripted, always surrounded by decay, by fear, and by the unknown. In cities like Venice, they were ordered to wear bells, to warn others of their approach. In London, they worked with watchmen, to lock infected homes, and mark doors with red crosses, "Lord have mercy upon us," written on the wood. Their role faded as knowledge grew. By the 18th century, germ theory, quarantine methods, and organized hospitals began to replace them, but the image endured. Long robes, gloved hands, that long curved beak, an enduring symbol of medieval fear, of a world without answers, and of those who stepped forward, not to heal, but to witness, to count, to be present at the collapse of public health, and to carry the weight of death. For centuries, across Europe, and far beyond, there were men tasked with one of society's most brutal duties: executioners. Often feared, often reviled, rarely named in public, but always necessary in systems of justice, where death was seen as punishment and spectacle. Executioners carried out orders, not judgments. They did not decide guilt, they simply enforced the sentence, through beheading, hanging, burning, dismemberment, or other methods prescribed by law. In medieval Europe, public executions were common, held in marketplaces, city squares, or hills outside town. They drew large crowds, cheering, jeering, spectators of death, watching heads fall, or bodies burn. Executioners were expected to be skilled, especially with the sword or axe, A clean beheading required precision. Too shallow a blow, and the victim suffered. Too deep, and the executioner risked breaking the block, or his own tool. Botched executions led to panic, riots, and public disgrace. In France, the Sanson family performed executions for generations, including the famous guillotinings during the French Revolution. In England, the headsman of the Tower of London handled noble prisoners, including Queens Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, each death recorded in ledgers, with tools passed from father to son. Some executioners were professionals, appointed by the crown, given salaries, uniforms and housing. Others were selected by lot, a townsman chosen at random, forced to carry out the task, or lose his own life. Many executioners lived in isolation, outside city walls. Their homes marked, their families avoided. Despite being agents of the law, they were untouchables in many eyes. Their presence polluted wells. Their hands were considered unclean. They sat alone in church, and their children were shunned. Yet they held knowledge of anatomy, of wounds, of how to cause a quick death, or a slow one. In some regions, they also served as torturers, extracting confessions before death, or exacting punishment short of execution, lashing, branding, maiming. These too were their duties. A full-time occupation, in service to the law. The role differed across time and place. In the Ottoman Empire, executioners were anonymous, identified only by their clothing. After completing a death sentence, they washed in special fountains, and avoided public roads. In Imperial China, executioners practiced swordsmanship, training for years to make a single clean cut. In Japan, during the Edo period, headsmen worked for the shogunate. Their methods included decapitation by katana, often after formal ceremony. In colonial America, hangmen carried out death sentences, often in view of entire towns, using gallows and ropes that sometimes broke or failed to kill quickly, leading to prolonged deaths. With the rise of the Enlightenment and growing discomfort with public executions, the role changed. The guillotine was introduced in France to make death fast and humane. Its operator became a technician, still feared, still necessary, but slightly more removed from the act. In modern states, executioners became agents of the government, often unknown, performing lethal injections, or overseeing electric chairs, invisible to the public, removed from the crowds, but still carrying out the final act of state power. The job persists, though fewer know the names, and fewer still understand the burden. The emotional toll of ending lives, day after day, in the name of law. Executioners remain a shadow of the justice system, present when it ends, and often gone before the next begins. During the Napoleonic Wars, from the late 18th to early 19th century, military campaigns stretched across Europe. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the move, marching through fields, over mountains, into cities and fortresses. With them came not just weapons and horses, but an enormous logistical burden. Food, water, tents, ammunition, and human waste. For Napoleon's Grande Armée, one of the largest fighting forces of its time, even basic sanitation was a challenge. And in every camp, on every march, someone had to deal with the filth. Latrines were dug hastily, sometimes just shallow pits, sometimes barrels, sometimes wooden boxes placed over dugouts. But the real work began after use. Napoleon himself traveled with chamber pots, carried by servants or orderlies, who were tasked with emptying them discreetly. Several times a day, these men were known among the ranks, but rarely mentioned in records. They were assigned to high-ranking officers, or noble aides, handling bodily waste, cleaning pots with rags and buckets, often in cold weather, often on rough terrain, and always in haste. Because the army never stood still for long, Their job also included cleaning privies at encampments, using shovels and spades, lining pits with straw, then burning or burying the contents, to limit the smell and the spread of disease. It was essential work, but degrading. Other soldiers mocked them. Even officers avoided eye contact. But when a general's chamber pot needed emptying, they were called without question. Sometimes they marched with separate wagons, carrying waste barrels and lime to reduce odor and slow decomposition, exposure to waste, to flies, to runoff in open trenches, led to illness. Dysentery spread rapidly. Typhus and cholera followed, especially when camps stayed too long in one place. Medical staff tried to limit outbreaks, but poor sanitation undermined their efforts, and it often fell to the lowest-ranked workers to clean up and move on. During the Russian campaign of 1812, when temperatures dropped below freezing, chamber pots cracked, waste froze inside them, latrines became unusable, men relieved themselves in snowbanks, and disease spread through the weakened ranks. Even the emperor's own latrine crew could do little to stop it. Thousands died not in battle, but in camp, from infection, from dehydration caused by diarrhea, from exposure, after vomiting or collapse. The men who handled the waste worked until they too fell ill, and then were replaced, with no honors, no medals, no mention in dispatches, only the knowledge that someone had to do it, and without them, even the greatest army in Europe would have collapsed under its own filth. After battles, latrine crews were sent to hastily clean the field camps, often among corpses, broken equipment, pools of blood and refuse, with only carts and barrels, and the rising sun behind them. They worked quickly, before the next march, or the next skirmish, sometimes alongside burial details, other times entirely alone, disposing of the unseen waste of an empire at war. Their uniforms were stained, their faces ignored, but their role was vital. In the shadows of military glory, in the unclean corners of history, they carried the burden of every meal eaten, every illness endured, every function ignored by history books. They were Napoleon's latrine cleaners, and they followed the army everywhere it went. In ancient Rome, wool was one of the most common textiles, used for clothing, bedding, and furnishings. But raw wool, freshly sheared from sheep, was oily, dirty, and full of lanolin. To make it usable, it had to be cleaned, scoured, and softened. This work fell to the fullers, known in Latin as fullones, men who operated fulling workshops in cities and towns across the empire. The process was labor-intensive and deeply unpleasant. It began by soaking the wool in vats filled with warm liquid, usually human urine, collected from public urinals or brought by individuals in exchange for small payment. Urine contained ammonia, which helped dissolve grease and loosen dirt. In fulling vats, the wool was submerged and then trampled by foot. For hours at a time, fullers would step in, barefoot, and stomp rhythmically, in a back-and-forth motion, pressing the cloth down, turning it over, and pressing again, all while knee-deep in the urine solution. They worked in shifts, enduring the strong odor, the slippery texture of the soaked cloth, and the risk of skin infections from prolonged contact. The workshop floors were often wet, the air filled with ammonia vapors. Eyes would sting, skin would crack, but the job was essential. After soaking and stomping, the wool was rinsed, usually with clean water, then brushed and beaten with wooden paddles to soften the fibers and prepare it for dyeing or weaving. Some fullers also bleached cloth, using sulfur fumes or white clay to make it brighter and more desirable for sale. The fulling process improved the fabric, making it thicker, more water-resistant, and better suited for Roman garments like togas and tunics. Fulling shops were widespread, found in nearly every Roman town, often grouped together near streams or aqueducts, where water could be easily accessed, or waste could be drained. Away's large workshops employed many laborers. Some were free men, many were slaves, working long hours in toxic conditions. Their labor made Roman clothing possible, even for the elite, who would never set foot inside a full launica, and never smell what went on inside. The Roman state recognized their role. In some cities, fullers formed guilds, with organized rules, religious rituals, and even public statues dedicated to the trade. Despite their unclean work, they were part of civic life, but never fully respected. The use of urine in fulling was so widespread that it became taxable. Emperor Vespasian famously imposed a urine tax on those who collected and sold it to fullers. When his son Titus objected, Vespasian reportedly held a coin from the tax to his nose and said, "Money does not stink." A phrase still quoted today as a reminder that usefulness often outweighs dignity. The work of fullers declined with the fall of the Roman Empire, as urban centers collapsed and textile production shifted to local household levels. But in some regions, the tradition continued for centuries, with variations. Wool cleaning with urine or other caustic agents persisted in medieval Europe and into early modern times, until chemical detergents and industrial machinery replaced it. The legacy of the fullers remains buried in ruins, stone basins, drainage channels, workshops etched into the archaeological record, reminders of a time when clean cloth depended on filthy labor, and when every toga in Rome carried the silent trace of urine-soaked wool pressed beneath the feet of men whose names were never written down. In the 18th and 19th centuries, across whaling ports in New England, in the Arctic, and aboard long voyages across oceans, whaling ships set out in search of massive creatures, for oil, for bone, and for profit. When a whale was caught, harpooned, dragged beside the ship, and finally killed, the hardest work was still ahead. The flensing, the cutting, the processing of the carcass. Whale blubber cutters were assigned to this task, climbing onto the slippery body of the dead whale, floating beside the vessel, or hauled partially onto a platform, using long-handled tools called boarding knives or spades. They sliced through the thick outer layers, removing blubber in long, heavy strips. Each strip weighed hundreds of pounds. It had to be winched up and stored aboard the ship. The process was brutal, messy, and incredibly dangerous. The whale's body shifted constantly in the water. Oil oozed from the cuts, turning the surface slick. Men slipped, fell, and sometimes drowned. Others were crushed between the ship and the whale, or caught in the ropes and pulleys that hauled the blubber upward. Blubber cutters were soaked, head to toe, in whale blood, in oil, in tissue and bone fragments, their boots filled with it, their hands blistered from the constant sawing motion. The smell was overwhelming. Fresh blubber emitted a greasy, rancid scent, but old blubber, stored on deck or in barrels, began to rot quickly in the sun, attracting flies, maggots, and scavenging birds. Once the blubber was brought aboard, it was cut into smaller chunks and thrown into large iron pots, known as try-pots, set over open flames. Here, the oil was rendered, boiled for hours, releasing thick black smoke and an acrid odor that clung to every surface. Men tended the pots day and night, stirring with long wooden poles, skimming the scum from the surface, and pouring the oil into wooden casks. The heat was intense. Try-works often caused burns or fires on board, and during storms, the boiling oil could spill, causing severe injury or igniting the deck. Whale blubber cutters worked in shifts, sometimes 18 to 20 hours at a time, especially after a large catch. Because the carcass would rot quickly and had to be processed before it spoiled, they rarely slept, barely ate, and endured weeks at sea without proper washing. Their clothes stiffened with dried oil, their hair matted with grease. Even in port, they were easily recognized by the smell, by the stains, by their quiet demeanor. Most ships processed multiple whales per voyage, each one yielding tons of blubber, used for lamp oil, lubricants, soap, and margarine. Whale oil was a major industry, and blubber cutters made it possible. Without them, the carcasses would rot, the oil would be lost, the voyage would fail. Some cutters were experienced hands, others were young, new to the sea, learning by doing, learning by mistake, and always doing the dirtiest, most exhausting work aboard the ship. Whaling declined in the late 19th century, as petroleum replaced whale oil and synthetic lubricants took over. But for nearly 2 centuries, blubber cutters were the hidden engines of the whale oil economy, turning floating corpses into barrels of gold, with knives, and fire, and blood. In marshes and ponds across Europe, especially in England, during the 18th and 19th centuries, a small group of workers made their living by wading into cold, stagnant water, wearing heavy clothes, or sometimes no shoes at all, to collect one of the strangest medical supplies of the time, leeches. The leech collectors, often poor, often women or children, walked slowly through wetlands, letting the leeches attach to their skin and drink. Only then could they be gathered, pulled off gently, and dropped into containers, usually glass, jars, or wooden boxes filled with damp moss. Each collector might harvest dozens a day, sometimes hundreds, depending on the time of year and the condition of the marsh. The demand was high. In 19th century medicine, leeches were used for bloodletting, a common treatment for fever, inflammation, bruising, and dozens of other conditions. Doctors believed removing blood could rebalance the body's humors, so leeches became essential tools, applied to arms, necks, eyelids, even inside mouths. Hospitals ordered them by the thousands, so did private physicians and pharmacies, which kept them in large tanks, ready for use. The best leeches came from specific regions, where the water was rich in organic material, and the weather cool and wet. Collectors knew these places well, walking for miles, with skirts or trousers rolled high, to reach remote ponds. But the work was painful. Leeches attached quickly, and drank for minutes, or longer. Their bites were painless at first, but left small wounds that bled for hours, because leech saliva contains anticoagulants. Over time, collectors developed sores, chronic infections, swollen limbs, and sometimes anemia from repeated blood loss, yet the pay was minimal. A few pennies per dozen, enough for bread, not enough for rest. Many leech collectors worked alone, but some were part of small family groups. Children were especially valuable, because their skin was softer and attracted more leeches, which made collection faster, though more dangerous. Infections, fever, and fatigue were common. Some children collapsed in the fields and still returned the next day. In France, Germany, and Britain, the trade grew rapidly during the early 1800s. At its peak, millions of leeches were harvested each year. In Britain alone, leech imports reached over 40 million annually, mostly from Eastern Europe, where wetland harvesting became industrialized. By mid-century, leech populations began to decline. Over-harvesting reduced numbers in the wild. Some marshes were drained for agriculture, others polluted by industry, and slowly, the supply shrank. At the same time, medical science changed. Bloodletting fell out of favor, replaced by germ theory, sterile techniques, and new drugs. Leech collectors faded from view, their trade no longer needed, their tools left behind, in museum jars, and old medical texts. Yet for nearly 100 years, They stood in the water, still and silent, covered in mud, bitten by dozens at once, to provide a tool for a medical practice now long gone, a strange, grim, and quietly painful job that left no record but the marks on their skin. In the tanneries of medieval Europe, and well into the 18th and 19th centuries, leather was one of the most essential materials, used for shoes, belts, armor, books, and countless everyday items. But turning raw animal hides into usable leather required one of the filthiest trades in history: tanning, a process soaked in rot, stench, and decay. Tanners worked at the edge of towns, downwind, near rivers or streams, where the waste could be dumped unnoticed. Their job began with fresh hides, often straight from the slaughterhouse, still bloody, covered in fat, flecks of flesh, and stiff from drying. These hides had to be cleaned first, soaked in water, then scraped with knives, to remove remaining tissue and hair. The hair was loosened using lime, a corrosive chemical that burned the skin. Tanners stirred hides in vats of lime water, using long poles, or their bare arms. Accidental splashes caused rashes, eye damage, even chemical burns. After dehairing came the next phase, the soaking in bait, a softening solution made from fermented animal dung, usually dog or pigeon droppings, rich in enzymes that broke down fibers and made the hide more pliable. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of rot, feces, and ammonia. Vats of dung sat in the sun, covered with flies, attracting rats, and producing thick, choking fumes. Tanners stirred hides through the sludge, sometimes with sticks, sometimes with their feet, soaking each skin for days, until it softened and absorbed the enzymes. Then came the tanning itself, using tannins, plant compounds from bark, leaves, roots. Oak bark was common, ground into powder, mixed with water, and added to tanning pits, where hides were submerged for weeks or even months. The process preserved the skin, turned it into durable leather, and gave it the familiar brown color. But it was slow and required constant monitoring. Vats had to be stirred, hides repositioned, spoiled batches discarded, all while standing in filth. Tanners were always coated in grime, their hands stained brown from tannins, their clothes stiff with old fat, their boots rotting from chemical exposure. They smelled of decay, of blood and dung, and were often banned from entering markets or places of worship. Children mocked them, and few married into tanner families. Despite their vital trade, they were social outcasts. Tanning yards were often guarded to keep thieves away, because finished leather was valuable, but also to keep people from seeing the process or smelling it up close. In some towns, tanners formed guilds, protecting their craft, regulating apprenticeships, and lobbying for space outside city walls because their work, though disgusting, supplied nearly every trade. Shoemakers, bookbinders, harness makers, all relied on the tanner's product. As industrial methods emerged in the 19th century, tanning became faster, using acids and chemicals, but also more toxic. Chromium salts replaced vegetable tannins, causing new health risks, and still producing foul waste. Modern leather production is cleaner, more efficient, but in some parts of the world, traditional methods remain, and workers still stand in open pits, still handle hides with bare hands, still breathe in centuries-old fumes, doing one of the world's oldest and dirtiest jobs. In Victorian England, and across Europe, during the 18th and 19th centuries, a peculiar practice emerged, combining medicine, science, and entertainment. The public unwrapping of mummies, imported from Egypt, purchased by collectors, doctors, or wealthy enthusiasts, and displayed in drawing rooms, lecture halls, and museums, where the wrappings would be removed, layer by layer, in front of an audience, often for a fee. Mummy unwrappers were typically surgeons, anatomists, or self-proclaimed experts. Their goal was to examine the preserved body, to marvel at the condition of the skin, to recover amulets, to demonstrate ancient burial practices, occasionally, to find supposed medical secrets. But the spectacle was far from scientific. It was messy, uncontrolled, and at times grotesque. The mummies were dry, brittle, filled with resins, oils, and dust. Unwrapping them released centuries of decay, powdered linen, bone fragments, and the smell, a pungent mix of mold, old embalming fluid, and human remains. Crowds watched as each bandage was stripped away, sometimes thousands of feet of linen, wrapped around limbs, torso, and head. Unwrappers used scissors, scalpels, knives, and bare hands to expose the body beneath, fingers blackened with age, skin taut and leathery, eyes sunken, sometimes still filled with resin, teeth exposed in a dry, open jaw. It was part curiosity, part shock, and entirely accepted as entertainment. The practice became fashionable. At universities, in salons, at private parties, mummies were imported by the shipload, purchased from dealers, often looted from tombs without documentation, smuggled out of Egypt in pieces, sometimes disassembled and packed in crates, their historical value ignored, their spiritual importance dismissed, all for the sake of spectacle. Some unwrappers wore formal dress, conducting the event like a lecture, while others encouraged audience participation, passing around bones, or placing jewelry on display, amulets, scarabs, beads, sometimes still embedded in wrappings, were collected like trinkets, sold, or displayed on mantles. The body itself was often discarded afterward, thrown away, burned, or left to rot, a human life reduced to an afternoon's amusement. The belief at the time was that mummies held healing properties. Some ground them into powder, sold as medicine, called mumia, thought to treat wounds, or stop bleeding. Even into the 18th century, mummy powder appeared in apothecaries. Despite its complete lack of benefit, by the late 1800s, public opinion began to shift. Archaeologists and cultural institutions called for preservation and respect for the dead. Unwrapping events declined, though some continued into the early 20th century. Today, most surviving mummies are kept in climate-controlled displays, studied with non-invasive tools, like CT scans or X-rays, but the legacy remains of a time when human remains were open for sport, and ancient bodies were stripped bare for curiosity, one linen strip at a time, by men in coats, with blades in hand, and no concern for the silence of the dead. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as medical schools expanded, and anatomy became a formal science, the demand for human cadavers grew rapidly, but legal sources were few. Only the bodies of executed criminals could be dissected, and executions were declining. So a new, underground trade emerged: grave robbing, carried out by men known as resurrectionists, or body snatchers. Their job was to steal the freshly buried dead. Under cover of darkness, from cemeteries on the edge of towns, they worked quickly and quietly, 2 or 3 men to a team. One stood watch, while the others dug. Not the entire grave, just the head end, enough to reach the coffin. Once exposed, they broke the lid, slipped a rope around the neck or shoulders, and pulled the body up, leaving clothes behind, to avoid charges of theft, because in most places, stealing a corpse was not considered a felony, but stealing the clothing, or grave goods, was. Resurrectionists were often paid by the head. Medical schools and private lecturers paid handsomely for intact, fresh corpses. Some bodies fetched several pounds, more than a laborer made in weeks. The work was dangerous, not just physically, but legally and socially. If caught, they risked arrest, public humiliation, or violent mobs. Many townspeople took turns guarding graves. Families installed iron cages, called mortsafes, over fresh graves, or hired night watchmen with guns. But the body snatchers adapted. They bribed sextons, used horse-drawn carts for quick escapes, and scouted burial grounds daily, looking for new graves and loose soil. They operated in London, Edinburgh, Dublin, Boston, and New York. Wherever medicine needed bodies, they followed. Some became infamous, like Burke and Hare in Edinburgh, who skipped grave robbing entirely and turned to murder, selling their victims as anatomy specimens. Their crimes shocked the public and led to new laws. The 1832 Anatomy Act in Britain allowed medical schools to use unclaimed bodies from poorhouses and hospitals, legalizing supply and putting most resurrectionists out of business. But before that, for decades, body snatchers were essential to science. Even as they desecrated graves, even as they terrified families, their actions filled medical textbooks, trained generations of doctors, and advanced anatomy in ways no legal source could support. They worked with shovels, hooks, and bags of straw to cover their tracks, leaving behind torn earth and grieving families left to discover an empty grave. The coffin cracked open, the body gone. It was grim, unspoken, but profitable, and driven by a belief that the dead could still serve the living, one dissection table at a time. After a public execution, in medieval and early modern cities, there was still one final task to perform: the cleaning of the scene of death. Execution sites were messy, especially when beheadings, hangings, or mutilations were performed in public squares. The scaffold, stained with blood, pools forming on wood, or in dirt, bits of flesh, clothing scraps, or even severed heads left on display. Cleaning crews were brought in immediately after the crowd dispersed. They were not part of the justice system, not executioners themselves, but hired workers, often low-paid laborers, sometimes even prisoners. Their job was to scrub, to mop, to shovel, and to dispose of everything left behind. Wooden planks were washed with buckets of water, mixed with vinegar or lime, to cut through the smell of blood and reduce staining. Blood soaked into the ground had to be dug up, replaced with fresh soil or straw, to prepare the area for future use. Because public squares still had markets the next day, still hosted parades, or sermons, or town meetings, cleaning crews worked quickly, sometimes at night, sometimes under watch, to ensure they did not steal or desecrate remains. If the body was left whole, it was carted away to a burial ground, or displayed on a gibbet. But if parts were removed, limbs or heads, they had to be mounted on gates, walls, or poles. The cleaning crew often helped with this too, climbing ladders, driving spikes through bone, hanging remains as warnings, then cleaning their tools and leaving in silence. The smell lingered: blood, smoke, and burning flesh. If the execution involved fire, like heretics burned at the stake, or traitors' entrails tossed into flames, ash and charred remains covered the ground. Crews shoveled up bone fragments, scattered teeth, or melted metal from shackles. Sometimes locals helped, sometimes they watched, standing quietly as the evidence of justice was erased. In larger cities, like Paris, London, or Prague, dedicated staff were assigned to scaffold maintenance, keeping it clean, level, and safe for repeat use. Some scaffolds remained standing year-round. Others were built fresh for major events. Cleaning crews also dealt with gallows, where bodies hung for days or weeks until decomposition made them fall, or until officials allowed removal. In those cases, the cleanup was far worse. Rotting flesh, insects, bones detached from tendons, a heavy stench that could be smelled for blocks. Crews wore rags over their faces, drenched in vinegar, carried buckets of lye, and strong gloves if they had them. Some used tongs or hooks to avoid direct contact, but accidents were common. Hands cut on splinters, boots soaked through, and infections frequent. These workers were rarely named, their job unrecorded in most histories, but their presence was essential, because executions were theater, and like all performances, someone had to reset the stage. Without them, the cities would reek for days, markets would be empty, officials embarrassed. They worked in silence, and left no trace, except clean wood, and leveled ground, where just hours before, a life and a law had spoken. Before indoor plumbing, before sewer systems, before flush toilets became common, cities and towns across Europe relied on a different method of waste removal. The night soilmen, their job was to collect human waste, from chamber pots, privies, and outdoor latrines, usually during the night, when the streets were quiet, and the stench less likely to provoke complaints. They moved through alleys, courtyards, and behind tenements, carrying large buckets, barrels, or metal pails, stopping at each home or building to empty cesspits or collect the contents of privy vaults. Some climbed down ladders into the pits themselves, shoveling thick sludge into containers by hand. Others used long-handled scoops or small carts to move waste from one part of town to another, often to collection sites at the city's edge, where the night soil was dumped or sold to farmers as fertilizer, because the waste, despite the smell, was rich in nitrogen and valuable for agricultural use. But the job was filthy and dangerous. The pits could be deep, poorly ventilated, filled with toxic gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. Some workers fainted from the fumes, others slipped and drowned in the sludge. Falls from ladders or broken boards over cesspools were common and often fatal. The tools were crude. Wooden scoops, ropes, buckets leaking at the seams, and carts without proper seals, which left trails of waste along the streets. Despite their importance, night soilmen were despised. People crossed the road to avoid them. Shops refused them service. Children mocked them, and few ever spoke their names. They were the lowest rung of urban labor, yet their work kept cities from collapsing under their own waste. In London, Paris, New York, and countless towns beyond, they worked without rest, night after night, in all weather, through snow, through rain, through heat. They wore aprons, heavy boots, and thick gloves if they could afford them, but the smell penetrated everything: clothes, hair, skin. Even after washing, they carried the odor and the stigma. At dawn, they disappeared, returning their carts, emptying buckets, and preparing for the next night's round. Cesspools filled quickly, especially in crowded slums, with dozens of people sharing a single latrine, and no running water. In some cases, overflowing waste poured into basements or flooded streets after heavy rain. The night soilmen were often the first to know, and the only ones willing to act. Cities taxed households for waste removal, but rarely paid the men well. Many operated independently, charging by the visit, or by the volume removed. Some bribed officials for better routes, or to avoid penalties for illegal dumping. Because not all waste went to farms, much of it ended up in rivers, or buried in shallow pits, just outside town, where it seeped into wells, and caused outbreaks of disease, typhoid, dysentery, cholera, all linked to poor sanitation, and the slow, desperate work of night soil collection. By the late 19th century, with the rise of modern plumbing, and the construction of sewer systems, their numbers declined, but did not disappear. In many cities, especially in poorer districts, night soilmen worked into the 20th century, unseen, unacknowledged, but still vital, carrying buckets of waste through narrow alleys, down dark streets, so that others could sleep in relative cleanliness. During the Great Plague epidemics, from the 14th century through the 18th, as disease swept through Europe again and again, death came quickly, in homes, in inns, in city streets, leaving corpses everywhere. The dead outnumbered the living, and the living needed someone to remove the bodies. This grim duty fell to plague corpse transporters, also called dead cart drivers, bearers, or simply watchers. Their job was to collect the dead and take them to burial pits, mass graves, or burning grounds outside the city. They moved through towns at night, or in the earliest hours of morning, calling out their grim announcement, "Bring out your dead," a cry that became infamous, spoken through cloth-covered mouths. To avoid breathing the infected air, they wore long coats, leather gloves, and sometimes waxed hoods, but none of it truly protected them. They carried wooden stretchers, or wheeled carts, loaded with bodies, sometimes stacked 3 or 4 high, wrapped in blankets, shrouds, or nothing at all. Some were still warm, some had bled through their clothes, others had swollen limbs, bursting buboes, and blackened skin. Families often left the bodies outside, on doorsteps, in alleys, near church walls, too frightened to wait for formal burials, or too sick to carry their own dead. Corpse transporters moved quickly, without ceremony, without prayers, only a rough count, and a note to the city records, if records were kept at all. In larger cities like London or Florence, dead carts traveled in loops, hitting the same streets each day, returning to grave pits outside walls, where teams dug massive trenches, dozens of feet long, and several feet deep. The dead were dumped in layers, lime spread between bodies, to speed decomposition and limit smell, then covered with earth, until the next layer began. Sometimes, the transporters fell ill mid-route, collapsing beside their carts. Joining the dead they carried, they were replaced by others, often prisoners, or the desperately poor, paid in bread or small coins. The work was not voluntary, but necessary. Without them, corpses would have rotted in the streets, spread disease further, and created panic. Many wore bells on their carts, to warn others to stay back, or flags, painted red or black, to mark contaminated loads. Dogs and rats followed them, drawn to the smell, picking at dropped limbs, or gnawed clothing. The bearers drove them off with sticks, but could not stop them all. They traveled in silence, often alone, or in pairs, avoided by all, and spoken of with fear. Some were rumored to steal from the bodies, taking rings, coins, even teeth, but most had no time, only orders to fill carts, and reach the burial ground before nightfall. If rain came, the roads turned to mud, carts got stuck, and bodies slipped into puddles. Still, they worked on, because no one else would. By the 18th century, the role faded, as quarantines, public health reforms, and hospitals took over. But during plagues, when towns were paralyzed, and families hid behind locked doors, it was the corpse transporters, who moved through the silence, past broken doors, and shuttered windows, gathering the evidence of death, and hauling it away, one load at a time, until there were no more left to bury, or none left to do the burying. In the alleys and basements of 18th and 19th century cities, a constant menace scurried in the shadows. Rats, spreading disease, destroying grain, gnawing through wood, and filling homes with fear. To fight them, came the rat catchers, a lowly but essential profession. Their job was to track, trap, and kill rodents in homes, markets, warehouses, and sewers. They worked alone, or with dogs, terriers trained to chase and bite, or with traps, made of iron and spring mechanisms, or cages baited with cheese, meat. Some used poison, though it risked harming pets, or contaminating food. The best rat catchers were observant, patient, and fearless. They followed droppings, chewed edges, grease marks along walls, listening for scurrying sounds, or gnawing inside floorboards. They reached into holes, climbed into crawl spaces, crawled under buildings, or down into cellars, wearing thick gloves, or none at all. The work was dirty and dangerous. Bites were common. Rats defended themselves fiercely, with sharp teeth and sharp claws. Some carried diseases, like leptospirosis, typhus, or plague, especially in dense urban areas, where sanitation was poor and food was abundant. Rat catchers often smelled of their trade, sweat, dust, and urine-soaked traps. Children followed them in the streets, mocking, or watching with fascination, as they pulled dead rats from sacks, or showed off their dogs at work. Some catchers turned it into spectacle, hosting rat-killing contests in pubs, releasing dozens into pits, as dogs competed to kill them. Most spectators cheered, bet money, drank beer as the rats were torn apart. It was gruesome, but popular, and added to the rat catcher's income. Others sold live rats, to laboratories, or for blood sport, or to showmen who performed tricks with tame ones. The profession had its own tools: rat poles, used to spear or stun; smoke bombs, to flush them out of burrows; and wooden boxes, for carrying them alive. The best catchers could clear dozens, even hundreds, in a single day, from mansions, from tenements, or from sewer tunnels lined with nests. Some worked for cities, on contract. Others were self-employed, knocking door to door, offering their services for a few shillings, or a rat-by-rat fee. They were not welcomed socially, but always needed, especially during disease outbreaks, or when grain stores were at risk. In some regions, they were given licenses; in others, simply tolerated. But their role was clear. They stood between the city and an explosion of vermin. As public sanitation improved, and modern pest control emerged, the traditional rat catcher declined. But in some areas, the practice continues, especially in dense urban slums, where old buildings and poor infrastructure still invite infestations. The rat catcher remains a symbol of unclean streets, of dark corners, of the silent war against rodents, fought one trap at a time, by men and dogs, in shadowed cellars and dripping walls. In 18th and 19th century cities, especially in industrial Britain, chimneys became central to urban life, used in homes, factories, and public buildings, funneling smoke from coal fires, upward and outward. But over time, soot, ash, and tar accumulated inside, reducing airflow, increasing fire risk, and making routine cleaning necessary. This job fell to chimney sweeps, many of them children, small enough to fit inside the narrow flues, some just 6 or 7 years old. Their task was to climb inside, with brushes, or bare hands, and scrape soot from the walls, from bottom to top, or top to bottom. Depending on the flue's design, they climbed in with minimal gear, sometimes just a cloth cap, and a small scraper or brush, pushed upward by foot, or dragged behind them with a rope. The passage was tight, often no wider than a child's shoulders. Soot filled their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. Each breath brought coughing. Each movement scraped their skin. Flues were made of rough brick, jagged at the edges, and sometimes hot. If the fire below was not fully extinguished, children suffered burns, cuts, and crushing injuries from falls or collapses within the flue. They worked early in the morning, before households lit fires, often on rooftops or inside cramped attics, pushed by masters who waited below, calling out, urging them upward, with threats or with long sticks. Some boys became stuck, trapped for hours, or suffocated in the soot. When they emerged, covered head to toe in black dust, their faces smeared, clothes shredded, and arms trembling. They were rarely comforted, only sent to the next chimney, or told to carry their brushes to another home. They were poorly fed, lived in cellars, or slept in soot-filled sacks. Their lungs developed what doctors called soot warts, later linked to the first known cases of industrial cancer. The work also stunted their growth, bent their backs, and damaged their joints. Some became permanently disfigured. By the time they were teens, many were too large to climb, and dismissed, with no savings, and no skills for other trades. A few survived into adulthood, and became sweep masters, training the next generation. Continuing the cycle, the public began to take notice of the suffering of climbing boys. Writers, reformers, and clergymen condemned the practice, describing their injuries and early deaths. Campaigns were launched, laws proposed, but enforcement was weak, and demand remained high. Mechanical brushes were introduced in the early 1800s, safer and more efficient, but resisted by traditional sweepers, who relied on cheap child labor. Finally, in 1875, the Chimney Sweepers Act in Britain made it illegal to employ children under 10, later raised to 16, and enforced with penalties. The climbing boy disappeared, but the image remained. A soot-covered child, balancing on a rooftop, brush in hand, shaped by fire and shadows. A figure born of industrial need and social neglect, scraping soot from the arteries of the growing city, at the cost of his health and his childhood. In the 19th century, as coal became the dominant source of household heat, every fire lit in every home produced not only warmth, but waste. Coal ash, gray powder and black clumps that collected beneath the hearth, inside stoves, and around boilers. Over time, this ash built up in fireplaces, in bins, and in courtyards behind homes. It needed to be removed regularly to prevent choking fires, to make room for new fuel, and to keep homes clean and functional. This job fell to the ashmen, sometimes called dustmen, or simply collectors. They moved through city streets, pushing carts, or driving horse-drawn wagons, designed to carry heavy, filthy loads. Their job began at dawn, before households stirred, moving alley by alley, street by street, stopping at each building, where metal bins or wooden barrels waited, filled with ash, clinker and cinders. The contents were still warm, sometimes hot to the touch, mixed with bits of burnt paper, charcoal, occasionally broken glass, or nails, from firewood not fully consumed. The ash was scooped by hand, or with metal shovels, lifted into the back of the cart, often creating clouds of fine gray dust that clung to skin, filled eyes, and settled into every crease of clothing. Ashmen wore thick aprons, wool caps, and scarves pulled over their mouths. Though none of it fully stopped the dust, they coughed constantly, blew black from their noses, and carried the smell of burnt fuel in their hair, in their beards, and on their hands. They worked in all weather, in freezing wind, in heavy rain, even through snow, because the fires never stopped, and neither did the ash. In large cities like London, ash collection was organized by districts, contracted to teams, with routes, schedules, and quotas, but the work remained manual, labor-intensive, and endless. Each cart filled with hundreds of pounds of residue, some loads dumped in outer yards, some sold to brickmakers, because coal ash, when mixed with clay, could be reused in building materials. Other loads were buried, or dumped in marshy land, used to level fields, or shore up banks along rivers. Ashmen were essential, yet invisible. They moved quietly, without thanks, without comfort, and often, without fair pay. In working-class neighborhoods, they were welcomed reluctantly. seen as a necessary nuisance. Their boots left dark footprints, their hands stained the handles they touched, but without them, the ash would pile up, spill into streets, choke drains, and fill homes with grit and filth. They worked quickly, sometimes covering dozens of homes before midday, pausing only to wipe their faces or drink water from metal flasks. Lunch was simple: bread, cold meat, eaten while sitting on the edge of their carts, surrounded by soot and smoke. Some men brought their sons into the trade, starting as helpers, lifting small bins, or sweeping leftover ash from cobblestones. Others moved into different sanitation roles, or left when their health declined, because years of inhaling ash led to chronic lung problems, persistent coughs, and blackened sputum. Few ashmen lived to old age, and fewer still retired in comfort. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories largely forgotten, but their labor kept cities livable and homes functional until the mid-20th century, as coal use declined and central heating replaced open fires. The role of the ashman slowly disappeared, replaced by modern waste collection, with enclosed bins, mechanized trucks, and filtered disposal systems. But for nearly a century, they stood in doorways, lifted heavy barrels, and walked behind carts full of dust, one street after another, each scoop a reminder of the price of comfort, paid in ash and breath. Along the coastal settlements of Europe, especially in northern regions, where the shoreline curved into shallow bays, and fishing was central to daily life, a curious and unpleasant job emerged: sorting through ancient piles of discarded shells, oyster middens, mounds of shell waste accumulated over decades, sometimes centuries, from communities that consumed oysters in vast quantities. Fishermen brought the catch ashore, shells were shucked, and the meat removed for sale or consumption. But the shells remained, dumped in heaps behind huts, near docks, or in marshy ground by the tide line. Over time, these piles grew, hardening into layers, mixed with mud, rotten meat, algae, and fish waste. Eventually, when the piles became large enough, they had to be dealt with, and that job fell to the midden workers, often women, the elderly, or day laborers, with no other trade. They spent long hours in the open air, bending over piles of sharp broken shells, with metal scrapers, wooden tools, or bare hands, sorting through the mess to recover usable material. Because oyster shells were not just trash, they had value. Crushed and burned, they produced lime, used for mortar, fertilizer, and even whitewash for buildings. But first, they had to be separated from the sludge. Workers sifted shells from mud, removed barnacles, scraped away remnants of flesh, and tossed cleaner fragments into baskets. It was filthy work, and slow. Shells were sharp, they cut fingers, tore through cloth, and left splinters lodged in skin. The smell was constant: rotting seafood, salt, water, and stagnant pools of rain. Surrounding the middens, flies swarmed overhead, rats nested in the heaps, drawn by fish guts, and the occasional spoiled oyster left uneaten. Workers wore thick aprons, cloth tied around their mouths, and heavy gloves when they could. But injuries were constant, and infections frequent, especially in summer, when the heat made the piles ferment, and the stench intensified. During rainy seasons, middens turned to sludge, shells sinking into mud, tools getting stuck, workers slipping, covered in the mix of salt and decay. Many stood barefoot, to balance better in the wet, exposing their feet to cuts and parasites from standing water. Despite the conditions, the work had to be done. For each cartload of shells cleaned, another could be used. In lime kilns, where the shell fragments were burned at high temperatures to make quicklime, an essential building material used for plaster, cement, and sanitation. In some towns, local industries grew around shell processing, with workers employed full-time, sorting, crushing, and preparing shells for transport. They were paid by weight, or by the basket, which meant long hours for little return, and constant pressure to work faster. Oyster shell workers were also expected to clear the ground, level old middens, dig out piles too hardened to sift, and clear space for new waste. Because oysters were consumed daily, and new shells arrived constantly, by the bucket, by the barrel, by the boatload, the job had no end, only a cycle, shells in, shells out, rot, building, rot removed. Some workers were children, helping parents, or earning pennies before school, lifting light baskets, or spreading shells to dry in the sun. They grew up with sore backs, calloused hands, and a permanent coating of grit under their nails. As oyster consumption declined, and modern waste systems developed, the role faded. Mechanized sorting, and larger industrial lime sources, made small-scale midden work obsolete, but the remnants remain, old heaps buried under soil, visible in archaeological digs, where layered shells reveal centuries of discarded meals, and the labor that followed. Oyster middens tell a story, not just of diet, but of toil, of workers who stood ankle-deep in salt and decay, turning waste into resource, and carrying on, in the shadow of the sea, where the tide came in, and the shells piled up. In the world of early music, before plastic, before nylon strings, before industrial production of instruments, musicians relied on a curious material, drawn not from metal or wood, but from animals. Catgut. Despite the name, it did not come from cats. It came from the intestines of sheep, goats, cattle, and sometimes hogs, turned into strings for violins, harps, lutes, and surgical sutures. The process of making catgut was long, detailed, and profoundly unpleasant. It began in the slaughterhouse, where fresh intestines were gathered. While still warm, they had to be processed quickly, before decomposition began. Workers in the gut trade, known as string makers, cleaned the intestines by hand, removing fat, mucus, and contents left behind from digestion. The smell was intense, a mix of blood, acid, and animal waste. Each intestine was turned inside out, and scraped clean with dull knives, then soaked in alkaline solutions, to loosen remaining tissues. After soaking, they were stretched on frames, scraped again, and rinsed in cold water, over and over, until they were translucent, thin, and smooth. But the process didn't end there. To make strings strong, multiple strands were twisted together, in precise numbers, to create different gauges. Fine strings required only a few threads. For higher notes, thicker, lower strings needed up to 20 or more. Each twist had to be uniform, or the string would buzz, snap, or sound uneven. After twisting, the strands were dried slowly, sometimes over warm air, sometimes in the sun, too fast, and they cracked, too slow, and they rotted. As they dried, they were rubbed with pumice, to smooth the surface, then treated with sulfur fumes, to whiten them, and kill remaining bacteria. The entire process took days, sometimes weeks, depending on the humidity, the temperature, and the thickness of the string. Workers stood for hours at benches, twisting, scraping and stretching gut strands, their hands stained with oils, their arms sore from repetition, their clothes marked by the constant spray of water and fluid. The smell lingered. Despite rinsing, despite smoke, despite sulfur, the raw odor of animal intestines clung to every surface. Even finished strings carried a faint trace, recognizable to those who played, and those who made them. Catgut strings were prized, because of their tone, warm, resonant, capable of subtle vibrato and rich harmonics, but they were fragile, affected by moisture, prone to breaking, and sensitive to the player's touch. Musicians treated them with care, oiling them regularly, replacing them often, and keep instruments in controlled environments. Despite the difficulty, catgut dominated the music world for centuries, used by soloists, ensembles, and even in military bands. String makers were essential, though rarely acknowledged. They supplied royal courts, traveling performers, and village musicians alike. In some towns, entire streets were devoted to gut work, with workshops, drying rooms, and delivery carts full of twisted strands. They also supplied surgeons, because catgut made excellent sutures, absorbable by the body over time, and strong enough to tie off vessels. Hospitals ordered large quantities, packed in jars of alcohol, sterilized and ready for use, but their medical use required even more precision. Any remaining bacteria could cause infection, so surgical gut was cleaned more thoroughly and handled with special care. Still, the source remained the same: slaughterhouse waste, turned into life-saving thread and musical tone, by hands working in silence, day after day. As industrial processes took over in the 20th century, synthetic materials emerged: nylon, steel, polymers. Strings became more durable, more consistent, and easier to mass produce, but the traditional craft survived. In niche markets, for period instruments, and historical performance, where authentic catgut strings are still preferred, made by hand, in small workshops, from animals still raised for food, the smell, the scraping, the twisting, all remain unchanged, a link to centuries of craftsmanship, built from the inside out, of the animals we raised, and the music we played, in churches, in parlors, in concert halls, with strings stretched tight, drawn from gut, and bound by skill, in a job that began in blood and ended in song. In open-air markets across pre-industrial cities, before refrigeration, before sterile packaging, and long before factory processing, meat was prepared and sold. In the open, butchery was not hidden. It was done in public view, on stone tables, wooden blocks, and beneath canvas tents in crowded squares. At the center of it all worked the butchery assistants, laborers tasked with the dirtiest, bloodiest jobs. Before a cut could be sold, an animal had to be slaughtered, skinned, gutted, and quartered, and this labor was divided. Butchery masters handled the cleavers, made the cuts, set the prices, but assistants did everything else. They brought the animals in, held them steady, tied legs, dragged carcasses from wagons to hooks, often in the early hours of morning, before customers arrived. Slaughterhouses were rarely separate buildings. They were part of the market itself, or located just behind the stalls. Blood flowed through gutters, into nearby drains, or across cobblestones, mixed with straw and mud. Assistants worked ankle-deep in this mixture, with bare hands, or with gloves made of thick leather. They carried knives, ropes, pails, and buckets of hot water, to rinse tools, to wash away filth, or to scald pigs before scraping hair. The smell was constant: blood, fat, urine, and the sour odor of bile and waste. Each slaughter added to the mess: organs piled on tables, entrails coiled in bins, bones stacked for marrow, or split for soup stock. Assistants were responsible for cleaning these remains, sorting usable parts from refuse, and disposing of what couldn't be sold, often feeding scraps to dogs, or tossing them into carts for tallow rendering. The work was physical, brutal, and exhausting. Carcasses had to be hung, lifted with pulleys, or hoisted manually with hooks and harnesses. Hearts, livers, lungs, had to be inspected, cleaned, and set aside quickly before they spoiled. In summer, the heat made the job unbearable. Meat rotted faster, flies swarmed over everything, eggs hatched in minutes, maggots writhed under benches. Assistants worked with swatting hands, trying to keep the flesh clean enough for sale. In winter, their hands froze to knives, and blood iced over in buckets. But the work never stopped, because people needed meat every day, and fresh meat could not wait. Sanitary standards varied. Some markets enforced rules, others turned a blind eye, so assistants often worked in chaos, next to waste piles, or under roofs dripping with blood and fat. They were splashed with fluids constantly, their aprons soaked, their boots coated with grease, their faces marked by sweat and soot from boiling vats. Few people greeted them, fewer remembered their names, yet without them, no meat would reach the table. They sharpened the blades, swept the floors, wrestled with stubborn carcasses, and stood side by side with the master butcher. Without sharing the title, or the profits, many started as boys, learning to hold tools, to steady trembling animals, to clean intestines for sausage casings, or to scrub cutting blocks after hours. They earned pennies, worked 12-hour days, and were often beaten for mistakes. Some advanced to full butchers, but most remained assistants, until their backs gave out, or their hands lost strength. In port towns, they also cleaned fish, gutting hundreds of herring, or cod, stacking heads and bones for bait. The line between butcher and fishmonger often blurred, but the work stayed filthy and hard. Their fingers smelled of blood even after washing. Their homes carried the scent. Even their clothes, once clean, retained the mark of their trade. As industrial slaughterhouses emerged in the late 19th century, much of this work moved indoors, into large, tiled buildings with drainage systems and overhead rails for carcasses. But the assistants remained, now in shifts, now with rubber aprons and steel mesh gloves, but still doing the same tasks, lifting, cleaning, scraping, and sorting. Today, few remember the open markets, where blood ran through streets, and butchery assistants stood behind every meal. But for centuries, they were the hands behind the meat, the ones who prepared what others consumed, without thanks, and often without rest. In early soap production, before factories, before synthetic compounds, and before pleasant scents and colorful packaging, soap was made by hand, in boiling vats, over open flames, using raw, animal-based materials, and harsh, caustic chemicals. At the center of this process were the soap boilers, also called soap makers. But in the earliest days, they were not chemists or perfumers. They were laborers, stirring thick mixtures of fat and lye, with long wooden paddles, working in heat, in steam, and in stench. The process began with tallow, rendered animal fat, collected from slaughterhouses or butcher shops, stored in barrels, often rancid, soft and white, or brown and greasy. Soap boilers melted this fat, over fire, in large copper kettles, stirring constantly, to prevent scorching or uneven cooking. The smell filled the air, a mix of burning grease, boiled bones, and ash. To this, they added lye, a strong alkaline substance, made from wood ash and water, or later, from soda ash and potash, corrosive, capable of eating through skin. It was carefully ladled into the vat, sometimes by hand, sometimes with buckets and funnels. The mixture foamed, hissed, and thickened, producing caustic fumes that stung the eyes, burned the nose, and inflamed the lungs. Soap boilers worked without ventilation, in cellars, in small workshops, or behind homes, their clothes soaked with oil, their arms speckled with lye burns, and their faces red from heat and steam. The boiling phase could last hours, even days, as the fat and lye combined, in a process called saponification, it transforming into a sticky waxy mass. If done correctly, the mixture hardened into crude soap. If the balance was wrong, the batch separated, and had to be reboiled, or thrown out. Each batch was tested by eye, by touch, or by tasting a tiny flake on the tongue, to judge texture and alkalinity. Once thickened properly, the soap was poured into wooden molds, lined with cloth, or simply spread on stone tables, to cool and set. After several hours, the hardened blocks were cut into bars, or chunks, sometimes stamped with symbols, sometimes left plain, ready to be sold, or aged for weeks, to finish curing. The floors of soap workshops were slippery, with spilled tallow, leaked lye, and puddles of water. Workers slipped frequently. Tools fell. Burns were constant. Some lost vision from splashes of hot lye in the eyes. Others developed respiratory illness from breathing alkaline dust. For hours every day, they worked silently, methodically, because mistakes were dangerous, and ruined soap meant lost income. In cities like Marseille, Venice, and London, soap making grew into larger trades, employing dozens of workers. Some split fat, others hauled ash, others stirred or cleaned vats between batches, but the core remained the same: boiling, scraping, pouring, and cutting. Some soap was made for laundry, rough gray, used with washboards and boiling tubs. Other batches were refined, with oils or perfumes, for personal use. Among the wealthy, who never knew the labor behind each bar, in colder months, fats hardened quickly, making mixing difficult. In summer, soap turned sticky and attracted flies. Workshops swarmed with insects, drawn to the smells of fat and boiling residue. Soap boilers used rags, soaked in vinegar, to cover their faces, but the scent never left their clothes. Even after washing, their hands stayed rough, cracked from lye exposure, their arms marked by old burns, and their lungs filled with memories of steam and smoke. As industrial chemistry advanced, soap making changed. Factories used metal vats, steam lines, mechanical mixers, and temperature controls. The job of the soap boiler shifted from manual laborer to technician, but the early image remained: a man with a long paddle, stirring a boiling vat, in a room thick with heat, where fat turned to foam, and lye turned to soap, by hand, by fire, and by the quiet endurance of one of the dirtiest, most caustic jobs in early industry.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more videos just like